I believe that we are going to get along with the Russian people very, very well.
The Iron Curtain has descended across the country.
And resolute action.
I shall go to Korea.
I am not and never have been a member of the Communist Party.
We shall pay any price, bear any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe. Hell no, we won't go.
We believe that peace is at hand.
Will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States.
We understand each other better. That's a key to peace.
The Eagle and the Bear. Dispatches from the Cold War. Dateline, 1975. Space.
Houston flight, Zug Moskva. Корабль Союз готов.
In the summer of 1975, years of competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the great space race culminated in a unique bonding experience.
Apollo Houston, I got two messages for you. Moscow is go for docking. Houston is go for docking. It's up to you guys. Have fun.
After competing to orbit the Earth and reach the Moon, astronauts and cosmonauts transcended their political differences to try the ultimate feat in technological détente,
9 feet.
the docking of an American and a Soviet spacecraft.
3 feet.
At the exhilarating moment of contact, only a few observers would recall the tragic context in which this project had its origins. The fatal disasters which had befallen both the first Apollo and the first Soyuz. In the early years, the space race was paramount, whatever the costs.
Stop.
During the late 50s and 60s, both Americans and Soviets could boast of astonishing technological achievements, yet the Soviets were clearly setting the pace. They had established a dazzling series of historic precedents: the first satellite, the first man in orbit, the first woman in orbit. By 1965, they had launched 50% more life-carrying spacecraft than the U.S. In the spring of 1965, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov was the first man to walk in space. He was instantly accorded the status of national hero. The Americans were naturally desperate to catch up for reasons of technological pride as well as global public relations. In June of '65, astronaut Ed White took America's first cautious step in space. But the pace of the space race was dizzying, and it would soon take its toll. It would be America's newest hero, Ed White, and two colleagues who would pay the price. In January 1967, a flash fire consumed the first Apollo spacecraft on the launch pad.
As you have already heard this evening, the 3 astronauts for America's first manned Apollo spaceflight have been killed.
Just 3 months later, Soyuz 1 tangled its parachute on re-entry and crashed into the Kazakhstan steppes, killing cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov.
Had the American scientists known as much as the Soviet scientists knew, it would have been possible to prevent the tragedy with the 3 American cosmonauts. And if the Soviet scientists had known as much as the American scientists, it would have been possible to prevent the tragedy of Colonel Komarov.
But there was a Cold War on, and space was just another battlefield. 1968 saw a low point in superpower relations. It was the year that Soviet tanks rolled into Prague to crush that country's movement toward freedom.
4 forward, drift into the right a little.
The following summer, when the Eagle landed and the crew of Apollo 11 stepped out onto the lunar surface, the Soviets were cursing their bad luck as one of their own unmanned space probes crashed into the opposite side of the moon. In the space race, the Eagle and the Bear were dancing in step, but now the Eagle was leading. Amidst the enormous fanfare which the moon landing produced, President Nixon offered an open invitation that would later prove to be prophetic.
I hope that when the next great venture into space takes place, that it will be one in which Americans will be joined by representatives of other countries so that we can go to the new worlds together.
But with the moon thus captured, the U.S. space program lost momentum. Americans now turn their attention to more pressing earthbound problems like poverty, pollution, and the Vietnam War. With a climate hardly conducive to space appropriations, NASA officials searched desperately for a new raison d'etre. The proposal for a new space station, Skylab, seemed to offer one. But by the early 70s, the bulk of NASA's energies were focused on a single Skylab. And for many in the space program, it was not enough. Some American space officials perceived the greater need to be in the area of in-space rescue capability. Inspired by the growth of détente, a joint U.S.-Soviet test project in space was discussed. The Soviets did not immediately warm to the idea until tragedy struck their space program again. In the summer of 1971, 3 cosmonauts aboard Soyuz 11 died in space in a depressurization accident. This Soviet film, released a year later, chronicled the disaster with remarkable candor.
The 23rd day, and despite the appearance of normalcy, something has begun to go wrong. No one knows if it's mechanical or if the crew is getting tired, and the Russians in their narration never tell us. But then their hatch fails, and all communications cease. The crew is dead.
The death of the Soyuz 11 cosmonauts dealt the Soviet space program a terrible blow, one that would stall their progress for 2 years. Now, both the Soviet and the American space programs needed a rescue mission. The détente of the early 70s provided the perfect context into which to launch a joint mission. In 1972, President Nixon paid his historic visit to the Soviet Union, the first ever by an American president. To his list of foreign policy credits, the SALT I Missile Treaty, Vietnam Peace Treaty, the Open Dialogue, and cooperation in the field of science and technology, which included the peaceful exploration of space. The highlight of the agreement, the pledge to launch the joint Apollo-Soyuz test mission.
President Nixon and Soviet leaders signed one major agreement in Moscow today, a commitment to put U.S. astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts into space together by 1975.
The event gave rise to thoughtful American news coverage, which offered rare insights into the nature of the space race and overall U.S.-Soviet competition.
If you want a symbol of the society Lenin's heirs have built, this monument to space achievement will do it. Sleek, effective, alive with thrust. But its base is in trouble. They're constantly having to repair it, shore it up. Translating that metaphor, the machines that this society makes are great. But the base, the people who make them, are ill provided for. I have no doubt that someday Russia will, as the Russians say, catch up with America. The country is simply too rich to avoid it forever. But it's going to take a kind of a second Russian revolution, a peaceful one. Primarily just a change of mind by the leaders about how to free and to stimulate the people to make the best use of all these magnificent resources.
An astute prophecy, one that many hoped the Apollo-Soyuz project might help fulfill. The Eagle and the Bear will return in a moment.
In my mind, it will be the most visible Soviet-used cooperative effort of any kind in history, since it will involve...
In January of 1973, NASA announced the names of the distinguished space veterans who would form the American team for the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Air Force Brigadier Tom Stafford, a veteran of 2 Gemini missions, was named commander of the Apollo spacecraft. Deke Slayton was assigned the job of docking module pilot. One of the original Mercury astronauts, Slayton had been grounded for a minor heart irregularity through the 60s, and he regained full flight status in 1972. Third on the roster was former test pilot Vance Brand. After serving on 3 Apollo and Skylab backup crews, Apollo-Soyuz would be his first flight. In the spirit of openness, the Soviets even made their crew announcements uncharacteristically early. Leading the Soviet team would be Alexei Leonov, the celebrated cosmonaut who had been the first man to walk in space in 1965. Another Soviet pioneer, Valery Kubasov, was tapped to serve as Soyuz flight engineer. Joint training was due to begin that winter in Moscow. Around the world, conflicts were raging. A violent coup in Chile and the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East had provoked East-West confrontations. Yet relative calm reigned in Moscow, where the American astronauts received their first cosmonaut-guided tours. They were quickly submerged into lengthy joint working sessions. In a remarkable precedent, the astronauts were given permission to tour the Soviets' top-secret launch facilities at Baikonur, just as the cosmonauts would later tour Cape Canaveral. To help decipher the complexities of each other's technology, they underwent intensive language training to help overcome technical and cultural barriers.
When you dock, how are you going to tell Alexei we are opening the hatch?
Сейчас я открываю люк номер 1.
We've equalized the pressure.
Мы выравниваем давление из люк номер 1.
Everything is normal.
So normal.
How do you read me, Tom?
Отлично. Как слышите меня?
I read you well, too.
Their friendship continued to flourish during a joint training mission to Disney World.
The climax of the day were astronauts and cosmonauts riding the Starjets together.
Today we have a chance to prepare for our future flight on that integrated simulator, space simulator.
Had a ball. That was fun on Space Mountain. That's a real ride.
Oh, your language is better.
The project provided excellent public relations, yet some Americans viewed the joint mission cynically. They took a dim view of Soviet technology and complained that only the Soviets would benefit, technically as well as financially. One American space official portrayed the relationship as our arms around their shoulders and their hands in our pockets. In June 1974, Nixon and Brezhnev met for another summit meeting in Washington. They toasted the success of the Apollo-Soyuz project, reaffirming their commitment to joint efforts in space. But it would be their last summit together. The man who signed the Apollo-Soyuz project into existence would not share the limelight he had so carefully guided toward his astronauts. By August, the Watergate scandal forced President Nixon to resign. Vice President Gerald Ford replaced Nixon in the White House, inheriting the works in progress of détente, including the Apollo-Soyuz project. That fall, the astronauts and cosmonauts shared more earthly adventures during a visit to Texas, where they broke training to visit a ranch, enjoy a Texas-style barbecue, and chase some indigenous wildlife. While the space diplomats poured on the public relations, their political leaders were working to hammer out an arms agreement. The November summit meeting between Ford and Brezhnev in Vladivostok saw small breakthroughs toward that end, but it seemed the arms race would be less easily diffused than the space race. President Ford himself hosted an all-American crab fest for the space envoys on the eve of their departure. But the unresolved arms negotiations, combined with the recent fall of Saigon, clouded their otherwise sunny horizons.
We as Americans are very proud of our country. Our friends from the Soviet Union are very proud of their country. And our two countries in very recent years have sought to work together in space, in the environment, in medicine, in many fields, including an effort to resolve differences in strategic arms.
In the context of dwindling détente, the jovial joint Apollo-Soyuz mission was beginning to seem almost an anachronism. The Eagle and the Bear will return in a moment. July 15th, 1975. As launch time for the Apollo-Soyuz mission approached, the excitement in Moscow grew. The scale of the Russian media coverage had been unprecedented.
Almost all the articles stressed the political as well as scientific aspects of the joint mission. The Russian people were told Soyuz Apollo proves the wisdom of Leonid Brezhnev's dedication to détente.
For the first time in history, the launch would be broadcast live to more than 100 million Soviet viewers. Once the Soyuz was lifted into orbit, the focus shifted to Cape Canaveral, where the Apollo was preparing to launch 7.5 hours later. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism as the astronauts suited up and climbed aboard what would be the final Apollo spacecraft. In Moscow, Soviet citizens waited breathlessly to view something no Russian had ever seen before, the launch of an American rocket.
The Moscow Symphony broadcast a special performance of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue just before the launch of Apollo.
Halfway around the world, enthusiastic Americans also tuned in to witness the event.
Moving out. Clear the tower.
Roger, tower clear.
The historic rendezvous and docking was scheduled for the third day of the mission.
I'm approaching Soyuz. Tom, please don't forget about your engine.
In Moscow and Houston, the support teams anxiously awaited the greeting that would be heard round the world.
Contact. Soyuz and Apollo are shaking hands now. I'm opening hatch 3.
When Tom Stafford opened the hatch, and when I saw face of Tom Stafford and Dick Slade and your words, "Hello, Alexei," I said, "You are welcome on the board Soyuz spacecraft." I am open the hatch and say, "Hello, partners," in Texas language.
Cynics would call it the $250 million handshake due to the astronomical bill for what appeared to be only a public relations exercise. But for space buffs back on Earth, it was worth every penny.
I wish you successful completion of the planned program and a safe return to Earth. Leonid Brezhnev.
Gentlemen, let me call to express my very great admiration for your hard work, your total dedication in preparing for this first joint flight.
The space travelers dined together on cosmopolitan cuisine.
Right now, I've just finished some strawberries reconstituted, and Deke and I, Deke's eating some too, and we're getting ready to eat some borscht. After that, I'm going to have a turkey with apple and cranberry sauce.
During this lunch, I said, "It doesn't matter what you eat, but with whom you eat."
A good thing, as the eclectic meal had mixed results. Stafford's 3 tubes of borscht had to be followed by a triple dose of antacid.
Okay, copy. This is Apollo Control. Apparently
The following day, the space diplomats toured each other's crafts and got down to business. Onboard experiments included a study of fish disorientation in zero gravity and analysis of the radiation produced by extreme ultraviolet rays. After a steak lunch aboard Apollo, Commander Leonov took Commander Stafford back to the Soyuz for an afternoon press conference.
That when we opened this hatch in space, We were opening back on the earth a new era in the history of man. How this new era will go depends on the determination, the commitment, and the faith of both the peoples of both countries and of the world.
I said bye-bye, see you later on the ground.
2 days and 30 orbits later, the space diplomats exchanged final farewells, undocked their spacecraft, and began preparations for their return to Earth.
When we undocked, I thought it is finish of our joint flight. It is very sorry, but such is life. But Tom Stafford and American, the Soviet crew looking forward to our future cooperation.
Yet, in that poignant moment of parting, neither team realized that this would be the last U.S.-Soviet joint mission for many years to come. The era of détente was waning. The war in Angola, the controversy over Soviet dissidents, and mutual accusations of espionage would cause a resurgence in Cold War tensions. But for that brief moment of calm in the eye of the storm, a bond of friendship had transcended political boundaries to bridge the gulf between the eagle and the bear.
Next on A&E, meet the faces of valor from harrowing battles on land, sea, and air on Heroes.